Well, good afternoon. And what I was going to talk about is we're going to move forward in history about 200 years, from 1600 to about 1800. And I want to talk about this Bible, or the topic is going to be the 1812 Bible, published by the Bible Society at Philadelphia, which is the first American stereotyped Bible. But before I can talk about the Bible, and I really appreciate some of the things Joe said about printing, we need to talk a little bit about printing. Oh, no, well, let me go through the outline. First off, we're going to talk about what is printing and how does printing work, and a little bit about this idea. What is stereotyping? It has nothing to do with race relations or anything like that. It's a printing term. We'll talk about Gutenberg and movable type. Something we were just sort of alluding to, that idea of a second edition and the problems that come with making a second edition, and what stereotyping is. We'll talk about Bible societies, because you notice this Bible was printed by the Bible Society at Philadelphia. But we have to start with sort of, why do we have Bible societies at all? What was their goal? What was their mission? And the story of the Bible Society at Philadelphia. Then we'll have a chance to get to the 1812 Bible, look at Hill's 213, which has a lot of information about this Bible. And then I'll have some observations and questions, and then some conclusions at the end. So we'll begin with this guy, Johannes Gutenberg. And if I have to tell you who he is, I think we're missing out on something. Gutenberg is recognized as the person who had introduced to Europe mechanical printing with movable type. Before this time, any book that was produced by hand, manuscript. There was the idea of woodcuts and block printing. But Gutenberg was the one who came up with the idea of movable type. And we're all familiar with the first printed Bible, Latin, in 1455. So a very important person. And printing is extremely important in the history of humanity, really. I want to give a shout out, by the way, to the Dunham Bible Museum. I borrowed, I guess it's a polite word, a few pictures from their website. This is actually, I believe, their printing press that when we are in Houston, we'll have a chance to see. But just to give a brief overview of what is the printing process, and this is what Joe was talking about. When you're starting the process, you've got the thing is, we're going to set the first page. So you're sitting there with your case of type, and you're pulling the letters, you're arranging them together, and you're producing an image of that first page. And then when you're finished, then you're able to print multiple copies. So you put the paper on the type, print that page, and then you put the paper again, print it again, and do that for how many copies, Joe? 2,000 plus would be produced at a single print run. Then when you're finished with that page, this is the magic of the movable type, is that the type is removed from put back in the case, and then we're able to start page 2. So we would pull the type again, create page 2, go through this process. So we'll be going through this process for every leaf of the Bible. How many pages is that? Hundreds, thousands of leaves that are produced, each one of them. But when we're finished, we have not one copy, but 2,000 copies. So that's the process that goes through there. The problem, of course, is that what I call the second edition problem. Printing allows for the mass production of printed material. I probably would say that the Protestant Reformation depended on printing to get the message out. Luther, and some hiding out in Germany, was able to touch people all over the country through that printed word. The problem, of course, is we can produce hundreds or thousands of copies of a book in a very short time. It may seem like it takes a while, but in just a few days or weeks, you could have something, particularly a smaller book, out on the streets. Problem comes when that second edition is required. Joe was talking about how you start over from scratch. I mean, there really is, you're pulling page one again. You're pulling the type out of the case. You're putting it back into the forms. And you're going through this process over and over. Inevitably, copy two, second edition is different than first edition. It may be subtle. It may be a few spelling mistakes or some other errors, but they will be different. And the time it takes is going to be significant. So when you're looking at this problem, you're trying to figure out, how do I solve this second edition problem? And there are several solutions. One of them is what would be called standing type. And in this process, what you do is that once you set page one and it's good and right and ready, and then you just set it aside so that later when you need to do the second edition, it's already ready. You don't have to reset it for the second time. And if you will, if Rick Monroe was on, he would mention that this was something that was done in the United States. Isaiah Thomas produced a standing type Bible. He was not the only one. William Williams in Utica, New York did that for the New Testament. So the idea of keeping standing type around was one way of addressing this problem. The problem is it's very expensive. You've got to have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases full of type to produce not only one page, but you got to produce 1,000 pages perhaps, and keep them all in standing type, ready to go, just in case there's a second edition. The other problem, of course, is now you've got 1,000 cases filled with type, and you got to figure out where to put them. Keep them in the right order, keep them clean, keep them usable, those kind of things. So that's a solution to this problem. It's probably not the best one. Another solution is what is called stereotyping. And in this process, you create a plate from the type. So you set the type as you did the first time. You create a printing plate. And then later, if there's a second edition, you simply pull the printing plates and you're ready to go. It's much less expensive because you don't have to have multiple cases full of type, and you're ready to do that. And in fact, this idea of stereotyping continued well into the 20th century. You keep reusing that type each time, but this is the picture on the right is, as you can tell from the man sitting there, is probably a printer, probably from the 1940s or even 60s. What they would do, the process of stereotyping is pretty simple, actually. First thing you do is you set the type, as you've always done. And then you would create a mold from the type. And different materials were tried to do this. A very fine-grained sand, clay might be used. Plaster of Paris was used. Paper mache was used. Eventually, and in this picture, you can see them, he set the type, and then he has put a piece of heavy paper on top of it. And that would then be hydraulic presses to press it down. And then he would be able to create a plate from that. And then that would be just pouring in the type metal. Newspapers were printed by this method, how they would produce the newspapers well into the late 20th century. The origins of stereotype printing, obviously the idea occurs to people that this would be a good idea. The technology was the problem. We know that, I think Gutenberg sort of thought about it. I'm not sure he did anything direct on it, but people have been thinking about this. We are pretty sure that and I was trying to find the right reference for this. In 1725, William Gedd was producing a Bible at Cambridge using a stereotype process. In 1712, there was probably a German Bible. Again, a stereotyping process was used. Perhaps even as early as 1702, there were some printed works in Germany with stereotyping. It's usually considered the early 1800s that William Stanhope produced the wide application of stereotyping with some improvements of the technology. So here we're really not talking about Bibles, we're talking about technology. How do we produce books more efficiently? So that's the little bit of the history, not too much. Now we're going to move on to Bible societies. The British and Foreign Bible Society is considered the first Bible society. By the way, that picture on there is the cover of Herbert, for those who were talking about that. It was founded in 1804 in England, of course, and it had a mission, and really probably twofold. One of them is their mission was to circulate scriptures across the world. So you'll see that the British and Foreign Bible Society was producing Bibles not for the English-speaking world, but really for the world. Interestingly enough, their first publication was not of English Bible. Their first publication was the Gospel of John in the Mohawk Indian language. So you have that idea that we're circulating scriptures to the world. Their second goal was to make Bibles affordable and available to everyone. Now, if you're going to produce Bibles for the wealthy, well, you want nice ornate covers, you want to have a lot of pictures, you want to do it in a way that is beautiful because your patrons have the money and they can afford what you're going to be producing. When you want to produce Bibles for the world, then you've got to be a little bit more careful with your production process. So what they did is they needed to produce Bibles as efficiently and cheaply as possible. And to do that, well, they had some advantages. One thing, they have one title in their inventory. All we're producing is the Bible. They're not producing other books. They're not producing fiction. They're not producing anything else. Everything is the Bible, which works to their advantage. And they know their demand. It's large. They're going to be producing books for the world, for the entire English-speaking world, which at that time was expanding. So, you've got a big demand and you've got one title. This is perfect for stereotyping. It's the obvious solution to do this. You produce the plates once, and now you can keep producing Bibles day after day after day. You got one book on inventory, and you just keep producing them. Now, they would have different sizes, but basically, it's all the same text. So now we want to look at the Bible Society at Philadelphia. How did they come about? And they were founded in December of 1808. That's about 4 years after the British and Foreign Bible Society. But this idea of producing Bibles for the world or for the nation or for everybody was becoming very, very prominent. And between 1809 and 1911, they were raising money to buy a set of stereotype plates. And they were raising money from the other American Bible societies that were being founded at that time. And the British and Foreign Bible Society contributed, I believe, 500 pounds. I'm not sure how the conversion rate would go for the purchase of plates. So the British and Foreign Bible Society was very much involved in this process of getting these plates to America for the people in Philadelphia so that they could produce Bibles. And in 1812, they ordered plates from England. So they're ready to go. Now, I have to tell you, there's a problem. It required an act of Congress to allow the plates into the United States. Why? What else was going on in 1812? This little thing called the War of 1812. And if you look at this act of Congress, a statute from February of 1813, basically Congress decided that the duties on certain stereotype plates, Bibles, would be remitted to the Bible Society. So instead of having to pay huge duties, they were able to get their plates into the United States without any extra cost. So now the plates are here. Congress has acted, and we are ready to start. This is the Bible. By the way, the pictures are from my own collection, so they're all mine. This is the Bible. You can see it's a standard. Doesn't say King James, but of course it is. Out of the original tongues with the former translations diligently compared and revised. Notice that line, Stereotype edition. That's the first time you'll see that on an American Bible. And it's Stereotype 4, the Bible Society at Philadelphia by T. Rutt, Shackwell, London. So these are not Native American plates. They were made in London and imported into the United States. Stereotyping was a fairly closely held trade secret as long as they could. And it won't be until 1815 that an American company will be able to produce stereotype plates. If you're interested, this is Hills 213. The other thing they were able to do, since they have these plates, they're not limited to complete Bibles. They could also produce New Testaments. And this is the title page from the New Testament from a separate edition, separate binding, I guess I should use that word, identical. This title page does appear in the complete Bible, and it's exactly the same, only it has New Testament. For some reason, this one got omitted, obviously, in early listings of Hills, or putting it together. And this is number 222A. It's one of the few places I've known that Hills had to add a letter A to any kind of any kind of numbering. You thought they'd have had this one on their list. So let's look at Hills 213. It's a fairly long entry. Talks about the Bible Society, Stereotype by T. Rutt. Notice the size of this book, 633 pages in the Old Testament, 192 in the New Testament. We're talking a book that's approaching 850 pages. So it's a fairly large book. I don't know if you can see when I hold it up. You know, it's a thick little book. So let's look at this entry. First off, it says that the plates were received in October, fairly late in the year of 1812, and that they were handed over to a local printer, William Fry in Philadelphia. So Fry obviously had to figure out what to do with these plates. He's never worked with plates before, had to figure out how he was going to do that, but he was able to do that and had an initial print run of 1,050 Bibles and 750 New Testaments. So I can believe, you know, Joe was talking about what types of print runs would you have. He was saying 2,000. Well, they were running 1,000 plus 750 of a shorter New Testament. But then it's interesting here. You go on down the reading and you see that there was a 6th printing in May of 1814. And that brought the total number of Bibles to 14,125 and 3,250 New Testaments. So 14,000 plus 3,000. So there's a lot of Bibles being produced. If you do the math, you'll discover that that means that there were 17,375 Bibles and New Testaments produced in a time of about 20 months. So this was done, you do multiply it out, and that means that every day, 30 Bibles, New Testaments were coming off the press, ready to go. So I don't know whether there was, how many presses he had, but certainly things are moving on at a pretty brisk pace. And that would assume they were working every day. Obviously, they would have taken out Sundays and other days. So even higher numbers, huge numbers of Bibles coming out. So I'll make a couple observations. There were multiple print runs between 1812 and 1814. Hills tells us there were 6. Were there more after 1814? Hard to know, but I suspect that even then we've got a 20-month period where we know there were 6 press runs that were put out. Can we distinguish one print run from another? That would be a question to know sort of what are you holding in your hand? And the answer to that is, let's see. These actually, when I say I have a Bible, actually I have 2 of them, which is important. It's always nice to have 2 of something. But if you look at these pages, notice the page numbers. They're both page 217, which, and they are identical, by the way. Stereotype plates would say that they are identical. But notice the signature letters on these pages. On one of them, it was signature T, and on another one, it's signature K. Now, what the signatures would have meant if you were printing a book with one plate at a time, that would be a folio. If you're printing 2 plates side by side, then you'd be able to fold the page and you'd be able to fewer presses of the paper to create the pages, and then you fold it to produce what you want to do. So you could produce maybe 4 pages on a piece of paper, or maybe it was 8 or 12, depending on the kind of paper size you have. So if you have big paper, you can print multiple pages on a time. If you have smaller paper, then you have to use fewer. And then each of those pages would be given an identifier, T or K. And then when the binder would come, he would want to get, he would know to go get an A, B, C, D, all the way through, so that he knew he had a complete set of pages ready now to then fold and bind. But when you see a T and a K, that means that there was at least 2 times that they were running the pages through the press, and they were using different paper sizes on each one of them. But both of those Bibles that I'm holding in my hand are identical, except for these signature identifiers. They both say 1812 on the title page. So I have a question. Was the same title page date, 1812, used for the other print runs between 1812 and 1814? And my answer to that is a resounding probably. It's obviously, and I'll tell you why. I hold 2 1812 Bibles in my hand. They have different signatures. Therefore, there were at least 2 press runs. That Hill said there were 6. I can distinguish 2 of them. But then if you go to WorldCat OCLC and start looking for Bibles with the Bible Society at Philadelphia imprint, you will not find any dated 1813 or 1814. Now, I know it's dangerous to argue from a negative. The fact that I cannot find any doesn't mean that tomorrow someone finds one and says, here it is. But that idea that there are none would tend to argue the fact that they probably used the same date for the entire time from 1812 to 1814. So some of my conclusions based on that is, first off, this is an extremely important early American Bible. This Bible paved the way for the American Bible Society. The American Bible Society became the largest printer of Bibles in the 1800s. And they would have, million copies produced. I mean, when you see a Bible offered for sale in the on eBay, that's an American Bible Society, the American Bible Society was producing millions of Bibles with the intention of distributing them. And they were selling testaments, particularly for pennies a piece. The idea was to get Bibles into the hands of people. And this Bible, this technology, was one of the pieces that they used. They also went to steam-powered presses. They went to other innovations that just allowed them to just drive that cost to the bottom. But it's not especially rare. And I say that anyone who looks for early American Bibles discovers that this is a time when you don't see a whole lot of Bibles sometimes. But for this one, I found a lot of them. There's 17,375 Bibles and Testaments produced out there somewhere. And while I can tell you over the years, I've actually owned 4 copies of the Bible and 2 copies of the New Testament. Now, if that original run of 1,000 was all that was, for me to find 4 of them would be rather unusual, and to be able to purchase them. But they're not also particularly expensive, depending on how much a person wants to offer them for, a couple $100, maybe 4 to 5 sometimes, you can find a copy. So that's the 1812 Bible. I hope you've enjoyed that. And now, do you have any questions on things you'd like to ask? If I can try to answer them, I will. Stop the share. So any questions?
Stephen, I have a question.
Sure.
This is regarding the first half of your presentation with the stereotyping the Bibles.
Mm-hmm.
Is it true also that those, so 2-part question, is it true that those Bibles made with stereotype also typically had about 2,000, to go back to Joe's presentation, about 2,000 copies made from each plate?
What would happen is you would take the plates, put them on the press, print them out, then you put the plates back in the storage. Tomorrow, next week, next year, when you're doing it again, you take them out and you're pressing again with the exact same plates. So they are identical. You can't tell the difference between, except if you see those things like I was showing you with the signature letters, they are exactly the same book. And you hold these up and they line up exactly.
So with the metal type, is there a typical limit of number of copies that you would typically be able to get out of a plate? Do we know that?
There are limits. I'm not sure if I'm the metallurgist to tell you that, but if you look at these plates, what will happen is that over time you will begin to see wear on them, and they will not be as clear. So it is possible that if you had, I have 2 Bibles sitting here, so that's not quite enough. But if I had 20 laying out side by side, open to the same page, then you would probably be able to say this one is printed more clearly than this one. And that would probably say that this one is earlier than that one. But what a printer would do is, of course, new sets of plates are pricey. So as long as they think they can keep pushing it, they will continue to keep using the plates.
Hmm.
So there's probably best practices number, which would say, use it 10 times. There's probably the printer who's going to say, I can really stretch that to 15. And then there's somebody out there that says, 30. So, but there's more research to be done. I mean, it would be neat to be able to, like I say, I've got 2 now. 2 isn't really enough numbers to answer that clearly.
And then my second question is the process of stereotyping, since it's an impression made from an exemplar that then is pressed and used after that. Is there a degradation of type between the initial plate and the stereotype plate?
That's part of that technology question about what would be the best way of doing that impression. And so people were trying different kinds of things. Obviously, today, if you were trying to do this, you're doing something like a child's Play-Doh. You're not going to get a very good impression. So, but if you can use a very fine-grained clay, maybe you get a better one. Plaster of Paris, you may get a better one. Paper mache. So you're trying to balance ease of use. Clay may be hard to work with. Paper mache may be easier to work with, but clay may give you a slightly better impression than something like that. Eventually, newspapers. Like I remember in the 70s going to see how newspapers were made. And they were using a process where they would take paper and under hydraulic presses, press it down to create the mold that they would be using. Obviously, it's newspaper. It's today's edition that's trash tomorrow kind of thing. So they weren't worrying about the quality, but I think that's where the technology was sort of the leading edge of that. So it was a good question. What's the best method? And that's also those trade secrets. Somebody who's got a good method is not really going to share it with the competition. So I think that, it was a learning process. How do you do this and how do you do this well? By the middle of the 1800s, it was a very, very well-developed technology. And we continue on into the 1960s, and maybe even later. I don't know that they use, not sure how newspapers are produced today. They may still use a similar process, but it involves, I'm sure, computers and lasers and stuff like that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Any other questions? I'm going to ask Alice to go ahead and stop the recording.
Steve, I'll jump in one quick from the very beginning. Did you, was it the British and Foreign Bible Society? You said that their first published Bible was the Mohawk language version of John? Correct. Did I hear that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
I will tell you a further story on that. The 1804 Mohawk John was then brought to the United States and used to create the 1818 American Bible Society Gospel of John, which was the ABS's second non-English Bible. They did the letters of John in the Delaware language a little bit earlier that same year. And when they produced their edition, they copied the 1804 British edition, and they copied it so well that they copied the errors so that they actually have corrections at the end that if they'd have been thinking, they'd have fixed them. But it's an interesting little connection between those two copies of John.
No.
Anything else?
Can I